Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining us this evening. Before we begin today, we'd like to acknowledge that the District of Saanich lies within the territories of the Lekwungen peoples represented by the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, and the Wasanich peoples represented by the Sartlip, Pockwitchin, Sayout, Sycam, and Malahat nations. Here's a high-level agenda outlining what we will be covering today. We will start with a quick orientation to the webinar platform and introduce our partners, our presenters. Planning staff will give an overview of what SSMUH is, what you can build and where, and new zoning regulations. Engineering staff will review servicing requirements needed for SSMUH. And finally, inspections and planning will explain the permits needed and how you can get ready to apply. We will then end the session with a Q&A period, which I will give more details about in a moment. The purpose of this webinar is to provide information on the new small-scale multi-unit housing bylaw and its implications for development in Saanich. We are not seeking feedback on the SSMUH zoning bylaws. These bylaws have been adopted and in effect since June 30th of this year. This webinar will also not address questions related to specific properties. Please direct any questions referring to your site to zoning@saanich.ca. For members of the public who are joining us this evening, we will be discussing some technical requirements about building small-scale multi-unit housing. The industry professionals you engage for development on your property will be able to help you navigate these in more detail. And of course, just a reminder that the District of Saanich is a respectful workplace. Respectful conduct is expected from all participants in this webinar. We welcome everyone to participate and want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to ask questions. Disrespectful behavior, including bullying, harassment, or discrimination, will not be tolerated. Please be advised, disrespectful participants may be removed from the webinar. The question and answer feature is open. You may ask questions using this feature throughout the webinar. Please note that we may not have time to address everyone's questions. All questions will be submitted will be recorded, directed to the appropriate staff member, and then published on Hello Saanich and the district's website after the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be published on the District of Saanich's website. All participants, please be advised that by attending this webinar, you consent to your questions being recorded and published online. All other participants will be able to view your questions, so a reminder to exclude any personal information. Now on to the question and answer feature. Here are a few features to be aware of to facilitate your participation in this webinar. Click Q&A at the top navigation bar. Q&A feature will open in a sidebar on the right of your screen. Type into the Ask a Question field and click Ask. The two arrows allows you to filter the questions you see the most upvoted or the most recent posts. You might like to play around with these filters to see what other participants are asking. Finally, if you see a question that you also want the answer to, click on the arrow to upvote. This will help us to focus our time to answer the most common questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, type them into the Q&A. We will have a dedicated Q&A period during which Allison from Planning will help direct questions to the appropriate presenter. Today, we will be covering material that is in the SSMUH guide. You can type these short links directly into your browser, or you can click on the link in the Q&A. Key links are pinned to the top of the Q&A function for easy access throughout the webinar. And now for a few introductions. This evening, we are joined by district staff from several different departments: planning, engineering, and inspections. This evening, we have joining us Carly Friesen, Amanda Blick-McStravick, Caitlin Yankoff, and Allison White from planning, Darcy McKay from engineering, and Roy Thomason from inspections. I will now turn it over to Carly to give us an introduction to small-scale multi-unit housing.
Thanks, Kelsey. I'll start by talking about what is small-scale multi-unit housing, or SSMUH. SSMUH is also known as missing middle or gentle density. This type of housing may include homes such as duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, or homes with secondary suites and garden suites. Small-scale multi-unit housing supports a variety of unit sizes, making it desirable for a range of residents and families. SSMUH is a type of infill housing that fits well on existing neighborhood lots. These housing forms provide this infill housing in areas that are predominantly single-family homes. So why are we talking about SSMUH and SANH? The Local Government Act was amended by the province and now requires that all local governments have zoning bylaws that allow 3, 4, or 6 homes on lots that were previously zoned for single detached or duplex use, depending on the lot size and location. The areas where zoning is required to permit 6 units are based on the lot's proximity to a transit service level that's defined in the legislation. The province also released a policy manual which includes guidance and best practices for local governments on how to create viable infill zoning regulations. The legislation also specifies that local governments must not unreasonably restrict SSMUH densities or forms with any of their land use bylaws. The intention or the aim of the legislation is to increase housing supply and diversity in suburban neighborhood areas across BC. And this intention also aligns with the SANH OCP policy of supporting infill housing in neighborhoods. The District of Saanich adopted their SSMUH zoning in June 2024, rezoning approximately 25,000 lots to permit SSMUH. These lots were previously restricted to single detached homes. The new zoning regulations define houseplexes, which include forms such as duplexes and townhouses, and support multiple units in these small-scale building forms. The regulations also support the retention of an existing home. We know there are benefits here, including environmental benefits and making it easier for homeowners to develop their property over time. The regulations were designed to promote the viability of infill development while including regulations that promote the livability of the new units, such as ensuring there's good open site space. The zoning amendments also scale the regulations to the number of units provided, giving greater buildable area and reduced setbacks to developments with more units. I'd also like to note that SSMUH units can either be rental units or strata units. The developer may choose whether to rent out or stratify, adding additional tenure types to neighborhoods. Upon adoption of the SSMUH zoning, the SSMUH guide was developed as shown just now in the introduction. The SSMUH guide was developed as a collaboration with staff from planning, engineering, and building inspections, all of whom you'll hear from tonight. The information that we'll be sharing can all be referenced later in this guide. It includes step-by-step instructions on using SANH map to determine your lot permissions and parking requirements. It includes information on how to prepare your application and what to expect during the approvals process. It also includes technical information that can be referenced by your design team, including diagrams, definitions, and contact information for SANH departments. As noted in the introduction, during today's presentation, you'll hear some overview material and also some very technical material aimed at the professionals that will be supporting clients wishing to develop SSMUH. Now I'll give an overview of the zoning regulations that allow SSMUH, and I'll show you where you can find pertinent SSMUH zoning information in SANH's zoning bylaw. First of all, this map shows an overview of all the single detached lands that would be affected by the small-scale multi-unit housing zoning. Lots are grouped as either small, regular, large, or transit proximity area lots. The most common SSMUH lot type is regular lots. There are about 23,000 of these in SANH, and they're the golden color on the map. Most of these lots have RS6 zoning. Transit proximity area lots are the lots near transit service that meets the legislated definition. There are about 700 of these. Currently, they're all along bus route number 95. They're the purple color on the map. There are several lot types. There's several type of lots that are exempt from SSMUH zoning. That means that although SSMUH would be permitted, they have to satisfy certain conditions in order to be eligible to build SSMUH. So these conditions are that the lot must be within the urban containment boundary inside the sewer service area. If the lot is within a primary growth area, it must be smaller than 4,050 square meters, and the lot must be completely outside of a provincially designated transit-oriented area. A little later on in the presentation, my colleague will be showing you how to determine what type of lot you have and if your lot fulfills all of these criteria. And she'll be showing you how to do that using SSMUH map. I'd like to note that for the purposes of the presentation today, we'll be focusing on typical and regular lots within SSMUH. Some lots do have special conditions, such as being within the ALR or having covenants registered. Please reach out to staff if there are any special conditions on your lot. Now I'll highlight the key sections of the zoning bylaw that enable SSMUH, and I'll show you how each of these sections look in the zoning bylaw. Firstly, eligible zones have small-scale multi-unit housing listed as a permitted use, and they list houseplex as a permitted form. Secondly, Schedule G has been added to the zoning bylaw, and the regulations in Schedule G are what regulate SSMUH forms, such as houseplexes. Section 5.37 of the zoning bylaw lists the conditions that I previewed on the previous slide. Section 7 contains the parking and bike parking requirements. And finally, I'd like to mention that the regulations generally were changed to allow both a secondary suite and a garden suite on eligible lots. Previously, only one or the other were allowed. So first of all, this screenshot shows the regulations for the RS6 zone. This is one of the most common zones in SSMUH neighborhoods, but I will note that these changes were made to all zones that were previously restricted to single detached homes or duplexes. So you will also see these changes in other RS zones, A zones, and RD zones. You can see under permitted uses that small-scale multi-unit housing has been added, and you can see that houseplex buildings are an allowed form. If a property owner desires, the RS6 zone still allows them to build a single detached home, in which case they would use the regulations seen here. If they choose to build SSMUH and they construct a minimum of one houseplex, they can build to the more permissive regulations in Schedule G. Now you can see a snapshot of Schedule G. You'll notice that it's laid out as a table with a set of regulations that apply to each of those groups of lots, so small, regular, large, and transit proximity area lots. The regulations change depending on which grouping you're in. You can see here that a minimum of 2 units in a houseplex form must be built to access Schedule G. You'll also notice that some of the regulations are dependent on how many units result on the lot. For example, the gross floor area increases the more units that are built. The next section shows you section 5.37, which lists those conditions that must be met, that the lot must be within the urban containment boundary and the sewer service area. If within a primary growth area, it must be less than 4,050 square meters, and the lot must not be within a transit-oriented area. Here it also lists once again that the lot must contain at least one houseplex in order to build to the Schedule G regulations. And finally, here are the parking requirements for SSMUH lots. They're located in Section 7. The parking requirement is 1 space per dwelling unit. If the lot is located in a regular transit area, which we'll also show you on SSMUH map, the ratio is reduced to 0.5 spaces per unit. If the lot is located in a transit proximity area, those are the lots that can build up to 6 units, there is no off-street parking requirement. On these lots, the developer may decide how much parking to provide. There are also bike parking requirements listed in Section 7. So now I'd like to give you an idea of what these zoning regulations enable. I'll show you a few examples and describe how the regulations support these. First of all, as mentioned, a property owner can use their regular RS zoning to maintain their single detached home and build a secondary suite and a garden suite, resulting in 3 units on the lot. Their base zoning regulations would still apply to the single detached home, and the garden suite is still regulated under the existing Schedule H for garden suites. I'll also note that the owner occupancy requirement was removed, so any of these units can be rented. If a property owner decides, they may access Schedule G, which regulates small-scale multi-unit housing forms and specifically allows the houseplex form. Next slide, please. The definition created for houseplex is broad. It's a minimum of 2 units, and they can be any form of attached housing. So that would include duplexes, row housing, or conversion of an existing home. A minimum of the 1 houseplex or 2 units must be built to access Schedule G. Secondary suites are allowed in houseplexes. For example, a duplex could have a secondary suite on each side of the duplex. A houseplex can be anywhere from 2 to 6 units, depending on the total number of units permitted on the lot. This example shows a 4-unit houseplex, 3 stories in height, and shows the maximum build area that the regulations would permit. Each unit is ground-oriented, and the zoning regulations support those larger family-sized units. For this height, there's a deep rear yard setback and an open site space requirement. These 2 requirements combined provide the opportunity for tree retention and planting, and provide an amenity space in the yard to support the livability of the new units. If a property owner decides, they may access Schedule G and retain an existing home, for example, while adding a duplex. A maximum of 2 buildings can be built under Schedule G. Schedule G also includes regulations for the separation space between 2 buildings, and again, there's an open site space requirement. Where there's a building in the rear yard, the pattern of the regulations follows the garden suite regulations. For lots that are allowed 6 units, the regulations also allow 1 or 2 buildings on the lot. This example shows a 6-unit houseplex. The regulations where 5 or 6 units result on a lot are more permissive. The rear yard setback and side lot line setbacks are reduced, and the allowable density is increased. One additional legislative requirement for lots in the transit proximity area is that local governments cannot require off-street parking. On these lots, the property owner can determine the amount of parking to provide. There are additional regulations in Schedule G, but I'd like to take a moment showing how the regulations, how a few of the regulations in Schedule G compare with RS6 zoning regulations and the garden suite zoning regulations. So as you can see here, the maximum number of dwelling units has increased, and the number of buildings allowed on the lot remains the same. 2 buildings are allowed. When we were testing the regulations, it really revealed the significant benefits to open site space and tree retention when limiting the number of buildings to 2. As far as density goes, Schedule G includes 2 density measures, a floor space ratio, or FSR, and a gross floor area, or GFA, and the applicant is instructed to use whichever is lower. The density is higher than what's allowed under the RS6 regulations to ensure that family-sized units can be accommodated in SSMUH. The height is increased to 11 meters. This allows 3 stories for houseplex forms. The height is reduced for buildings that are located in a rear yard, although still slightly higher than what's allowed for garden suites. The front yard setback has been reduced to bring the building forward and to preserve the rear yard for open site space. The amount of space here still allows for tree planting or to accommodate future infrastructure. The rear yard setback for a single building is consistent with the RS6 zoning regulation. This maintains the pattern of rear yards in existing neighborhoods, preserving the open site space in the rear yard. Where there's 2 buildings on the site, the building in the rear yard has a reduced setback, again, depending on height and kind of matching that pattern of setbacks required for garden suites. The site coverage is increased by about 10% in order to accommodate the larger number of units. This minimum increase is reasonable given the increased height. So essentially, because the units can be accommodated in taller buildings, we can preserve more open site space. The site coverage is increased by about 10% in order to accommodate, the open site space and front yard open site space are introduced in Schedule G. These areas must be landscaped, and they can provide space for tree planting or amenity areas for residents. I'll now pass it over to my colleague Amanda to give you more information on how to determine if SSMUH applies to your property and what your permissions would be.
Thank you, Carly. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to start on our small-scale multi-unit housing website, which you may have already visited, and we're going to take a look at the small-scale multi-unit housing guide that we've created to find our way to SANH map. There we go. So as Carly mentioned, this gives you a really good high-level guidance covering, we think, pretty much everything that you have to start thinking about if you're interested in building small-scale multi-unit housing in SANH. When it comes to SANH map, it will walk you through step-by-step how to find and navigate SANH map, how to identify if a lot is eligible for small-scale multi-unit housing. There's also a flow chart walking you through those eligibility criteria step-by-step here. And it will also guide you through the criteria to establish which part of Schedule G applies, which is related to lot size and the transit proximity area. And lastly, it also speaks to the parking requirements and how to find out which ones apply to a particular property. So we're going to go check out SANH map. There is a link in the guide, which we will click, and it takes you to our SANH map website. There's lots of information here if you want some more basics about how to navigate and use SANH map, but we're going to just launch the tool. And so SANH map now contains the map layers representing all the geographical criteria relevant to small-scale multi-unit housing. And these are set up to be referenced alongside the regulations in the zoning bylaw and with help from the small-scale multi-unit housing guide. I'll give you an overview of what this information looks like in SANH map, but please refer back to the guide and when you're ready to explore the map at your own pace. The first thing we will do is we're going to open the layers view down here on the left. And this shows you that there is lots of content here to explore. And we are going to focus, however, on the small-scale multi-unit housing theme that we've created. So in this dropdown, go pick this theme, and that opens up all these layers that we're going to reference on the map. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go up again to this left side panel, and there's an icon here. Click that and pick Show Legend. So this gives you another view in this panel that will help you understand what you're looking at on the map, basically. And then we're going to search for an address. So I have an example here that we're going to look at, 180 Homer Road. So search for that. Click on it, and the left panel here is pretty much where everything is happening. This is now where our search results come up. So we're going to click on the parcel, and we're going to click on the address again in this case, and the map zooms in to 180 Homer Road. We are going to start by looking at the details that show up here now about this parcel. And we can see here, we can confirm that the zoning for this parcel is RS6. And as Carly already shown, we know that small-scale multi-unit housing is a permitted use in RS6 zone. The other thing you're going to want to note here is you can see the lot area. So we have a property that's 973 square meters in this case. Once you've noted that, you can go back to your legend view. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit and talk about what we're looking at. Bear with me. Okay, so we have here the urban containment boundary as represented by this. There's a green, brownish green outline and a hatch. And we also have the the urban containment boundary is related to the eligibility criteria in the zoning bylaw. We have the transit-oriented areas, which is this dashed dark blue line, and that's also related to the eligibility criteria. We have the small-scale multi-unit housing transit proximity area, which is in purple, and Carly spoke about that quite a bit. That's related to which part of Schedule G applies, and it also affects the parking requirements. We have in blue the SSMUH regular transit area. And as we have noted here in the legend, this is only related to the parking requirements. And then lastly, we have the sewer service area, which is in the red here, and that is related to eligibility as well. So another way that you can try to figure out what applies to a particular property if it's difficult to read visually is you can right-click on the property, whoopsie, and go what's here. And what happens then is in the left hand, takes a moment when I'm screen sharing apparently, it's going to pick up all the layers that are turned on right now and are intersecting the point where I clicked. And so in this case, in our property, it picks up the regular transit area, sewer service area, the urban containment boundary. So for 180 Homer, we have now established that we're zoned RS6, so SSMUH is permitted. We are within the urban containment boundary. We are within the sewer service area. And then we have this other criteria in the zoning bylaw that says that if a lot is within a primary growth area, it must be less than 4,050 square meters for eligibility. And we know that this is a smaller lot than that, so we know that we're good on that front, but I'm going to show you the primary growth area in a second. For now, we'll also note that we are not within a transit-oriented area or a TOA. I'll zoom out again to show you that we do have one of those here around the Uptown Transit Exchange, and we are not in that area. It also did not get picked up in the panel here. So it seems like this property meets all our criteria for eligibility, but I'm going to show you how to look at the OCP primary growth area if needed. So the primary growth area is a designation in our official community plan. And one way you can learn about that and look at the maps is to simply look at the OCP, and there's a link in the guide straight to the document too. But there is also a theme in SSMUH maps similar to this theme about the OCP. So let's have a look. I'm gonna go back to the first, I'm gonna click on the parcel just so we can see ourselves again. There we are. Okay, and then I'm gonna go back to the legend. I'm down here on the left, bottom left corner. And I'm gonna actually go back to this layer list where we started so that I can go to this drop-down menu and pick the OCP theme. So now our view changes a bit on the map. It actually tells us right away in this case that we are in a non-PGA, so that's helpful. But we'll have a look again, go to this icon up here on the top left and go show legend so you can see what things look like in this theme. Zoom out a bit just for comparison, what else is around us. And we can figure out by looking at the legend and the map here that this property is in a neighborhood designation as opposed to a primary growth area. So we are not in a primary growth area. So now that we've confirmed that we can build small scale multi-unit housing here, let's go back to the SSMUH theme. So back to the layer list, back to the theme. And again, I'm going to go here again and choose the legend. So we know what we're talking about. And so let's find out which part of Schedule G would apply and what the parking requirements are. So Schedule G, which determines how many units you can build, along with other very important regulations, it references lot size and the transit proximity area again. And so 180 Homer is outside the transit proximity area. Let's zoom in a little bit. You can see it's close, but it's not covering our property. And the lot size is 973 square meters. So this, if you're looking at Schedule G, tells us we're in a regular lot, so we can build up to 4 units of SSMUH here. We can look for a comparison at these neighboring properties. 196 and even 190 Homer are actually partly covered by the transit proximity area, which would give them up to 6 units if that fits, and 0 parking requirements. For the purpose of the parking regulations, 180 Homer is in the regular transit area, so there would be a requirement to provide 0.5 parking spots per unit. So that's it. That was a quick overview of the SSMUH layers in SSMUH map. So I'll leave you with a reminder to please explore this further with the guide by your side. And if you're unsure of what you're looking at, you're also welcome, of course, to contact us in planning and we'll help you. And I'll pass over to Darcy now in engineering.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Hello, everyone. So first, I'd like to get started with a little bit of background. SANH, 40 to 70 years ago, was built to support predominantly single-family homes, and the infrastructure that is in the ground, as we know it today, in existing residential neighborhoods was built with that population in mind. The density shift to up to 6 units in certain areas where only one was previously existed will result in some proposals not being adequately serviced, as this land use was not envisioned when the infrastructure was first built. So what does this mean for SSMUH? All building permits in the District of Saanich are subject to the building bylaw and subsequently the subdivision bylaw. The subdivision bylaw is where the minimum servicing standards and specifications live and are applied to all projects in the district. Generally, if a proposal falls under Schedule G to the zoning bylaw, notably new construction, you will be subject to all minimum standards and requirements. Next slide, please. So what requirements could be expected? There are 4 general areas where requirements can be expected, and they are road, sanitary, storm, and water. And I'll touch on each one of those individually. Road. If the road fronting your property is of a substandard width and or does not have curb and or sidewalk where it is required by bylaw, you will be required to widen the road to the minimum standard with curb and sidewalk if required. Sanitary. You must have a sanitary service to the property with a municipal inspection chamber or clean out at the property line. Storm. Similar to sanitary, generally, you must have a storm service to the property with a municipal inspection chamber or clean out at the property line. Depending on where you are located and your circumstances, you may be eligible for alternative methods of managing your stormwater, such as on-site disposal and infiltration. The full list of requirements for this are found within our subdivision bylaw on our website. For those properties that are connected to the municipal system, you will be required to provide stormwater detention systems on your property. And lastly, water. You will be required to have the minimum water service size from the main to your property line or as determined by your engineer on the project for domestic water supply. As well, you must ensure that there is adequate water supply in the municipal main for the purposes of fire protection. I will take a moment to specifically talk about fire protection, as this has been one of the most challenging items with respect to engineering and small-scale multi-unit housing. So, fire protection, what is that all about? As I noted, projects are subject to the subdivision bylaw, and in there it notes that water supply for fire protection shall be in accordance with the Fire Underwriters Survey. The Fire Underwriters Survey is a national organization that provides data and assessments to help insurance companies, municipalities, and local governments with fire protection. They have a guide which is used for estimating the amount of water needed for effective fire protection and is used by professionals across the country. We have created an FAQ document to assist and provide clarity to the public how the district applies this guide. This FAQ can be found on our SSMUH and engineering web pages. For your SSMUH proposal, you will be required to provide fire supply calculations prepared by a qualified professional in accordance with the guide. This will tell us what your fire flow needs are, and from there, we will compare against the known flow in the area and advise on any deficiencies should there be any. Responsibility for upgrades. If the existing underground and surface infrastructure servicing your property does not meet the requirements of the subdivision bylaw, it will be the applicant's responsibility to design and construct. If through review of the project, it's determined that improvements downstream of the property, such as an extension or upgrade of the water, storm, or sanitary system is required, it will trigger the requirements of the excess services bylaw. What this means is that you would enter an excess services agreement with the district, and this agreement establishes the benefit that the improvements you are providing have for other properties in that service area. As those properties develop, the district would collect funds on your behalf and remit them to you over the lifetime of that agreement, which would be 10 years. It should be noted this process does not guarantee reimbursement of a portion or any of the capital costs you may have incurred, as it is dependent on the redevelopment of the benefiting properties. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a few other items I'd like to touch on here. We'll start off with site access. Generally, all properties shall have one driveway. Special considerations in accordance with our driveway access bylaw will be given for corner lots or those which is impossible or impractical to comply. Development cost charges. The district collects development cost charges for all new development to help fund broader growth-related underground and surface infrastructure and parks. The creation of additional units on a property, such as say a threeplex, will trigger a development cost charge to be applied to your project. Depending on the nature of the improvements required for your proposal, if the improvement is part of our DCC program, you may be eligible for a credit to your DCC charge. For information on how our DCC bylaw is applied to the SSMUH, we have created a DCC interpretation bulletin, which is located on our SSMUH webpage. Land acquisition. With the introduction of Bill 16, it has provided local governments with the ability at the discretion of a servicing officer to require land to be dedicated to the municipality as part of a building permit. At this time, the district has not appointed a servicing officer and therefore are not requiring land. It should be noted that this is expected to change, however. Coordination with capital improvement projects. The district is undertaking upgrades to underground and surface infrastructure throughout the district regularly, and their timing may impact your proposal. For example, if your street does not have a storm main presently and we are planning to construct one in the next few years and you wish to continue moving forward with your proposal right away, you will be required to provide adequate storm servicing in accordance with our subdivision bylaw in the meantime. That said, it may make sense to reconsider the timing of your project to align with when the district will be constructing the main. To learn more about capital improvement projects in your area, you can visit our capital improvements current projects website. And lastly, application requirements. Where there are frontage and or servicing improvements required beyond a simple replacement or upgrade of your existing sanitary, storm, or water service, you will be required to provide site servicing drawings and supporting documentation prepared by a professional engineer. These drawings would need to be approved and bonded for, including payment of any DCC charges prior to issuance of a building permit from the inspections department. All servicing drawings and relevant documentation, such as fire supply calculations that I mentioned earlier, would need to be provided with your building permit application. Next slide, please. Where do I start with everything? In preparing an application for an SSMUH development, you are encouraged to engage qualified professionals early to support your planning and assist in advising you on infrastructure requirements and associated costs. As well, you should contact development services in the engineering department, where they will identify requirements for road, sanitary, storm, and water specific to your address. And with that, in closing, I'd like to just note that engineering is currently in the process of replacing the subdivision bylaw to update very old standards and specifications and to ensure SSMUH related requirements are apparent for those that may be pursuing an SSMUH build. As well, we are exploring options to convey requirements in a more intuitive manner, such as potential decision matrices and or providing added functionality to our SANH GIS map to better understand what infrastructure is present in front of your property and what may be required in the case of redevelopment. Again, for now, as noted, anyone pursuing an SSMUH project, they are strongly encouraged to contact engineering, specifically development services, before proceeding. We will be able to provide you with ample guidance on infrastructure and frontage improvements that would be required as part of your project. And with that, I will pass it over to Caitlin.
Okay, so on to the next slide. As mentioned, the adoption of Schedule G and adding small-scale multi-unit housing as a permitted use means that infill housing no longer requires a rezoning as long as the proposed development complies with the use and density. In most cases, development permits will not be required if the development complies with all zoning regulations. While we say that these SSMUH forms are now as of right and they don't require a rezoning, I would like to emphasize the zoning does not give permission to begin building. All SSMUH developments will require a building permit and be required to follow all building code requirements to ensure the safety of all units. The building permit may come with additional consideration for siting and servicing requirements. If trees are being removed, a tree removal permit will still be required. The aim is to make the development approval process as similar as possible to the approval process for single detached homes. And now we'll hear from the Manager of Inspection Services, Roy Thomason.
Thank you, Caitlin. I'm going to briefly talk about some of the differences between building a single-family dwelling and when you get into a multiplex building. So a residential building with 5 or more units must be designed by an architect, and that is under the Architects Act. So there's no other option on that. You must hire an architect. If you're just doing 4 units, you can still do that with a designer. You can also use an architect if you like. However, we certainly encourage you to get some professional design help when you're preparing to apply for a SSMUH project. Something new in the building code is radon rough-in, and that would be required for each unit. That is a known gas that is also on Vancouver Island here. It was assumed previously that it wasn't, but it is actually many locations on the island. So that's something that the BC Building Code has brought in. Fire separations for between the dwelling units. They are different than secondary suites, where there's some relaxation of the fire separations based on the type of smoke alarms and where they are located. Where duplex, triplex, or fourplex, likely a 1-hour fire resistance rating is going to be required, unless they're all ones, no units above another unit, or just 1-story units, then there could be a 45-minute fire separation requirement. The continuity of the fire separation must go through the attic to the underside of the sheeting. So when you are applying, your designer should also include a truss package that shows how the trusses are, showing that the trusses do not penetrate that fire separation. Also, something else, protection of common soffits could be required. This is something where you have a window on the top floor and the soffit is close by. To prevent spread of fire, there may be some protection required for that soffit to prevent spread of fire. Next slide. With regards to plumbing, if the piping, the drain waste vent piping penetrates the fire separation, non-combustible piping is required throughout the entire project. There are some exceptions to that, and I can't get into all those, but there are some exceptions depending on where the piping is located. Water pipe service for a multiplex. Single family dwelling and duplex are allowed to be sized by a plumber. However, once you get above a duplex, the water pipe service size must be done by a mechanical engineer for sizing of the water service to the multiplex. Spatial separation is also to be considered between the dwellings if you have multiple two buildings on a property. And the requirements must meet 914, which is not the spatial separation requirements for houses, but other buildings. And spatial separation is a protection that's in the building code in terms of distance to property line or distance between buildings. Based on that distance, it would determine the type of cladding you have that possibly the type of construction if you needed non-combustible construction, and that it will also determine what percentage of that wall area could be actually windows. So that's what spatial separation does, prevents spread of fire from building to building. Next slide. So tree bylaw requirements, there's no need to apply for a tree permit separately. That can become part of the building permit process. Permits are referred to other departments, and parks would be referred, would get a referral of the application, and they can help determine what would be required for tree permitting. If impacts on bylaw protected trees, an arborist report will be required. This says may be required, but generally the majority of times an arborist report would be required. Certain features like driveways and site servicing cannot remove trees. There are some exceptions to that, but generally you really want to plan for, where your servicing is going to come in and where your driveway location may be, and preferably, obviously, avoiding any tree removal to install those services. Removal of protected trees often will require replacement trees. And if retaining protected trees, tree protection barriers, which is fencing around those trees, will be required, and that will be required before building permit issuance. And I'll put it back to Caitlin. Thank you.
Okay, so all applications resulting in 4 or fewer dwelling units on a parcel are exempt from a form and character development permit. A building permit is required for all applications. A form and character development permit is required to construct projects yielding 5 or 6 units on one parcel. These projects must align with the relevant criteria within the Development Permit Area Guidelines document, also referred to as the Design Guidelines. Take note of the General Guidelines section and Section 4 for houseplexes. The full Design Guidelines document is available on the SANICH website. Next slide. So please note, if your property has an existing development permit, you may be required to amend or rescind the permit before the building permit can be approved. For example, those properties with a permitted garden suite will have an associated development permit. If your property is located within any other development permit area, or DPA, such as the floodplain DPA or streamside DPA, you will need a development permit regardless of the number of units proposed. Next. So getting ready to apply, to the next slide. As part of the building permit application, applicants must submit a completed project data table. Both a fillable PDF and Word version are available on the SANICH SSMUH website. The project data table makes reference to the applicable section of the zoning bylaw, so you can easily determine what each line item means for your project. A completed project data table helps to ensure the applicable zoning bylaw regulations have been addressed. Providing the correct data helps the zone reviewer confirm compliance more efficiently. It's highly recommended to work with a professional when preparing all the necessary documentation. The next slide. Review the small-scale multi-unit housing guide with your design team to determine what can be done on your lot and within your budget. It is important to be flexible with your design as site conditions, construction methods, and other variables may require design changes. Prior to submitting your application, don't hesitate to contact SANICH staff with any questions. And to the next slide. We will now turn to a Q&A period. As a reminder, please click the Q&A feature on the navigation bar on the top of your screen to enter your questions. Avoid including any personal information in your question, and please upvote any questions you would like answered to help us prioritize. We will be compiling all the questions asked during the webinar and publishing written answers on the website, so be sure to check back and follow the SSMUH project on Hello SANICH. If we are not able to respond to your question today, we will still record the question and include an answer in our written follow-up. I will now turn it over to Alison White to help us direct questions to our staff presenters.
Thank you, Caitlin. So the first question, I just wanted to get some more information. It said, do A1 lots comply for SSMUH?
Yeah, so I can speak to that. So generally, as I suggested, you should check what your zoning is and check in the zoning bylaw that your A zone has SSMUH listed as a permitted use. And then the thing about A zones is most of our A zone properties in Saanich are outside the urban containment boundary. There are a few that are within the urban containment boundary. And as mentioned, there are those additional criteria so that you're within the urban containment boundary and within the sewer service area to be eligible. So yes, some of the A zone properties are eligible, but please check all the criteria applying to your lot.
Thank you, Carly. I just want to mention somebody has their hand up again. If they could post the question in the chat box, that would be great, so I can add it to the list that I've got going at the moment. So thank you. The next question I have is, in Schedule G, row 7B refers to the front yard open site space, SSMUH. The last column of this row reads 35%. In Section 2 of the Zoning Bylaw 8200 on page 2 to 6, the definition of front yard open site space, SSMUH, reads, means a continuous landscaped area in the front yard, excluding areas designated for parking and vehicle manoeuvring. This space may extend to include the side lot line setbacks. My question is 35% of what? The implication is 35% of the lot area, but it's not stated explicitly. And I do believe maybe the link I had to the guide, or the guide that the person was looking at, didn't have the updated graphics that we've now got to support the explanation of this.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. And we have received that question a few times. So that's correct. The answer is that it's 35% of the front yard. We just updated the SSMUH guide earlier this week. So refresh it on your browser, or if you've printed a version. We added a few more diagrams at the end. So now there's a diagram that describes how to determine where the front yard is and how to determine the front yard open site space.
Thank you, Carly. If the province is requiring this, is the province paying to upgrade all water, storm drains and sewer lines to the properties being densified? And has BC Hydro confirmed that they have the ability to provide enough electricity to all of these new builds?
I'll comment on that one. So sort of a two-part answer here. I'll speak to the first part first. As mentioned, SSMUH proposals are subject to underground and surface improvements in accordance with the subdivision bylaw, and any such improvements are the responsibility of the applicant. As well, I'd just like to highlight again that should the proposal trigger any deficiencies to municipal systems upon review by staff, rectifying those deficiencies would also be the responsibility of the applicant. And for the second part of that question regarding BC Hydro, BC Hydro has not confirmed nor denied this. However, BC Hydro is outside of the jurisdiction of Saanich, and I would encourage you to contact them directly with your question. What I can say, however, is that I do speak with them regularly about other matters, and they are receiving pressure from the provincial government, as are we, to ensure the appropriate measures are in place to align with small-scale multi-unit housing.
Thank you. Is a fire separation between a living space and the attic above that living space sufficient in place of fire separation between adjacent attic spaces above the living spaces below those attics?
There is an option to do a fire separation to the attic space. However, any penetrations of that by fans, bathroom fans, or light fixtures may require special protection or special fixtures. And the attic access would also have to be a rated access panel.
Thank you, Roy. Will the Quadra bus route have SSMUH bus stops allowing sixplex? The bus frequency appears to meet the BC government definition for 6 units near frequent transit bus stops. Monday to Friday, a bus must stop at least every 15 minutes on average between the hours of 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Saturday and Sunday, a bus must stop at least every 15 minutes on average between the hours of 10 a.m. and 6 p.m.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So yes, we used the definition in the legislation to determine where the 6-unit areas would be and to determine which bus stops met the definition. We worked together with BC Transit and also with our neighboring municipalities in the CRD to determine exactly how to apply that definition. There are some routes, for example, that appear to be eligible, but because they're split routes or a few of the criteria are not met, they don't qualify right now. We are going to be staying in touch with BC Transit so that as soon as those routes do meet the definition and as soon as they qualify, then that area will be eligible for the 6 units.
Thank you, Carly. What is the current building permit application process time?
Yeah, unfortunately, right now it is a lot longer time due to some changes that have happened with digitization and learning curve for staff. I believe we're looking at 8 weeks to 10 weeks.
Thank you, Roy. I have a property with an existing small 2-bedroom home, and am I permitted to build 3 additional units in a separate detached structure, i.e. a triplex? I have a rear lane access at this property. I also have a second property without a rear lane. I'm wondering if a new triplex is permitted on the second property.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So there's a lot of factors, I think, as we described. So I would encourage you just to look through the guide, determine if your lot is eligible and how many units you're allowed to build. I'm just looking at this quickly. So yeah, just take a look at what you're eligible to build, but buildings like a triplex are generally allowed under SSMUH.
Thank you, Carly. I've got one last question. So if anybody has any more they're thinking of, if you want to type them in the chat while this one's being dealt with, that would be great. Has SANICH created stock development plans for typical lot scenarios? Some cities and districts in the Lower Mainland have.
Yeah, that's also a great question. No, SANICH has not created stock plans. The province did create some, I guess they could be called stock plans that give an idea of what you could do with SSMUH. So those plans don't necessarily meet all of the zoning regulations, but they really give you a good idea of what some designs could look like. I can take a quick look for that and add it to the chat. Roy, did you have more to add?
Yeah, I just wanted those. I've seen some of those stock plans that the province have, and there isn't enough information to demonstrate that things actually comply with the BC Building Code, which is generally what is required for an application.
Okay, well, we'll let Carly find the link she was looking for. I don't believe any questions have gone unanswered so far. If anybody else has any more questions, could they please pop them in the chat now and we'll get you some assistance.
Thanks, everyone. We'll just give you a moment if there are any questions that come forward. Thank you.
We do have one now. Is a property within the primary growth area and within the primary corridor, such as identified on Shelbourne, is it eligible for 6 units automatically?
Once again, I would encourage you to follow the steps that Amanda walked through tonight to determine what your property is eligible for. Right now, there's only that small area that I showed on the map that's eligible for 6 units. So please do walk through the steps to determine what's possible.
And also you can send any emails to zoning@saanich.ca with specific addresses, so we can help you with a more detailed information.
Great. If no further questions, we'll just say that this concludes our webinar on small scale multi-unit housing. Thank you all so very much for attending and participating this evening. A reminder that the place to go for information and resources is saanich.ca/SSMUH. A full list of links to resources mentioned in the session will be published and shared along with the recording. And if you have questions related to your site, you can certainly send them to zoning@saanich.ca. Thank you once again and have a great evening.